Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. You all seem to dig my 11 facts on various hardware platforms videos, so hey, here's another one. This time I'm covering 11 facts for the Sony PSP that you maybe didn't know. Sony released the original version of the PlayStation Portable in December of 2004 in Japan. A US release followed in March 2005 with an asking price of $250. It launched in PAL regions like Europe a bit later in September of 2005. Now regarding the US, within 2 years of launch you could often find PSPs for between $150 and $200 new. The PSP arrived on the scene just a bit after the original DS. Now if you picked up a PSP these days and held it in your hands, its 4.3-inch screen might seem a bit small and low res, but it was nothing short of a revelation when the PSP was new and fresh. Also, Sony's paradigm with the PSP was completely different from Nintendo's. They wanted to essentially create a modern portable console, while Nintendo focused on reusing older technology to create more affordable devices in those days. Now there's a lot of information out there on the PSP and lots of interesting things that I could cover, so I narrowed it down to 11 of the more interesting facts, and that's what I'm going to share with you here today. So sit back, relax, and let's get on with it. The PSP was no sales slouch, ending up at about 82 million units sold. We have to start a bit with Nintendo here, but I'm not going to talk about them a lot in this video, don't worry. So the Big N had the handheld market locked up for about 15 years before the PSP came along. How locked up? Well, the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color sold a combined total of 119 million units. In layman's terms, that's a shitload of Game Boys. The original Game Boy launched in the US way back in the summer of 1989 and was packed in with Tetris. The Atari Lynx launched right at about the same time, but did not see much retail success. The Game Gear launched in 1990 and 91 in various regions, and was by far the most successful competitor to the Game Boy, having sold just over 10.5 million units. But it faded from the market, while the Game Boy and GBC were still going strong. A few other companies decided, hey, you know what? We like money, let's jump into that portable market. Bandai released various versions of its WonderSwan, SNK put out a few versions of the Neo Geo Pocket in color, and even cell phone manufacturer Nokia entered the fray with a few versions of the ill-fated N-Gage. All of these systems were utterly crushed. Now Nintendo completely dominated that market until Sony came along with the PSP in December 2004, as we discussed a moment ago. So that PSP sold about 82 million units and was really the only serious threat to Nintendo's stranglehold on the portable market. The PSP offered something different from Nintendo's handhelds. The technology and game quality was just a notch below PS2 and Dreamcast. Sony also made the PSP a multimedia machine, producing and licensing videos for the system in their proprietary UMD format, but we'll talk about that a bit more later. The bottom line here is there were a lot of high-quality games on the system, so it's easy to understand why it sold so well and was popular for quite a while. There were 5 major models of the PSP. Not counting special edition variations of the major models of the PSP, there were 5 different models of Sony's first handheld system. The original PSP is the PSP 1000, which is also known these days as the PSP Fat with an F or Fat with a PH. Gamers gave it the Fat moniker after the release of subsequent models, which were fan-dubbed Slim since they were thinner. Now there were minor tech changes under the hood to the PSP 1000's 4 revisions, but they were primarily to combat hackers and piracy. There were no real serious tech changes, other than a slightly worse screen in the last couple of revisions. Now the PSP 2000 was the first major new model of the PSP, and this is the one that most people at the time unofficially dubbed the PSP Slim. The PSP Slim wasn't just thinner, but also had some modified internals. It had twice the RAM of the original PSP model at 64 megabytes. Despite a slightly smaller capacity battery in the PSP 2000, it actually had about the same battery life as the original, thanks to gains in efficiency. Now there were also 4 primary revisions of the PSP 2000, and once again, they were primarily made to combat piracy, hacking, and firmware downgrading. The next major model was the PSP 3000. It features oval buttons under the screen instead of the half-circle ones, so when placed next to earlier models, it's easy to pick out the 3000. There were some changes made to the motherboard of this model, once again to combat piracy, which to be fair, was rampant on the platform. And of course, those changes and further motherboard revisions didn't really much help to stop that piracy. They were all defeated, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. Next up, the PSP version everyone loves to hate, the PSP Go, also known as the PSP N1000. The PSP Go got rid of things like like the UMD drive, so if you already had a PSP and a collection of physical games, Sony was basically saying, hey, you buddy. Also, there were many PSP games that were never released in the PlayStation Store and only exist on UMD. To make up for screwing their customers over in this fashion, at least they raised the price. Sony, who I can only assume was on some serious drugs at the time, charged $250 at launch for this thing, because it had a sliding control panel, I guess? But seriously, the regular PSP at this point was selling for like $150, so this was a big price jump. Now the PSP Go definitely had its fans who viewed the digital-only status of the device as forward-thinking, which I guess it kinda was. Sony just really needed to make an official way to get disc-based games onto it, which never materialized. Hey, at least hackers made it possible and came in to save the day. Sony jumped in the other direction for its final model of the PSP E1000 or the PSP Street. This one was built as a budget device. Several features were stripped out of the Street. It had the smallest battery, a mono speaker only, no Wi-Fi. What? That's right, no Wi-Fi, and it had some ports and buttons removed and more. The Street is neither well-loved or even well-known since it was only officially released in PAL regions in 2011. PSP Street sold for €99 at the time of launch, so really, it was not a bad deal if you just wanted to play your disc-based games. Hacking, homebrew, and piracy were rampant on the PSP. So within that previous fact, I mentioned a lot of motherboard revisions happened because Sony was trying to stay ahead of hacking and piracy. And yeah, that was the impetus behind many of the minor hardware and security changes that showed up in each model. So the state of things in summer 2024 as I record this is that it's really easy to hack and install custom firmware on basically any version of the PSP, which will let you do things like install and play emulators, add custom themes, custom plugins, play custom software, and yes, play backed up or pirated copies of games. These days, soft mods on the system are a snap. You don't have to buy anything or wrestle with any difficult steps to modify your system to allow this stuff. And while I certainly don't encourage piracy here, the mods and custom firmware were a great way to get legitimate backups of games you already owned onto the device so you didn't have to carry a bunch of UMD discs around with you. Now I don't know about anyone watching this, but over 99% of my PSP collection is physical, where I have the actual UMD games, boxes, and everything. I own exactly one digital download for the system, which I think came with something I bought on the PS3 back in the day. Now if Sony had implemented a method to get digital copies of games you owned on disc onto the system, I think the PSP would have been an even bigger success, and they would have had less of a quote-unquote piracy problem on the system. So I'm not going to list every single method that was available to hack the PSP. That's a topic worthy of its own video, and maybe I'll do that someday. But there were a lot of steps before PSP hacking was brought into the soft mod world. There were hacks requiring specific UMD games early on, then mod chips, the famous Pandora's battery, and more. But did the ease of hacking a PSP cut into its software sales? Maybe. It's hard to say for sure. Why? Because all the hardware and software companies estimate things like how much each download of a piece of software would cost, which is dumb, because not everyone that downloaded that piece of software would have bought it. Plus, some of the people who downloaded games to check them out in the first place would end up buying legit copies. Plus, on a system like the PSP, a lot of people were downloading games they already owned just so they didn't have to carry their discs around. So my rule of thumb, whenever a game company or movie studio gives you an estimate of what piracy costs them, it's probably less than 2/3 of their original estimate. You could connect some models of the PSP to a TV with component AV cables. You didn't need to wait for PSP emulation to play your PSP games on the big screen. You could buy a component AV cable for about 15 to 20 bucks and then run it straight from your PSP to your TV and get gaming. But the experience really wasn't all that great in some cases. Now, on my PSP 3000 at least, there were a lot of games that had additional slowdown and performance issues when played via the component out cable on a TV. And because of the relatively low resolution of the PSP, the image only took up a small portion of the screen. You could zoom in using TV controls and stuff, but the resultant image was pretty blurry and terrible. Now I have to admit, I was really looking forward to getting this cable when I got it back in the day. I mean, hey, this would have been an almost Switch-like experience, playing your games on the go when you're out and about, and then on your TV when you get home. But nope, after messing around with it a couple of times and seeing how poorly it worked with several games, I just never bothered with it. It was nice functionality to have, but in practice it wasn't that great. Now I should note that this was only available on the PSP 2000 and PSP 3000. Sony removed the ability to connect to a TV from the PSP Go and PSP Street, and the original PSP Fat or 1000 just never had it. The PSP was completely region-free when it came to gaming. Now this was awesome. Any PSP from any region could play any PSP game from any region. There was no region locking on Sony's PSP when it came to games. So if you wanted to pick up a game from Europe that was translated into English that never came out in the US, you could do that. I did that myself back in the day with Tales of Eternia. You could also pick up a game from Japan and just happily play it on your US PSP. Now, one other note on region locking though, there is a minor itsy bitsy teeny weeny yellow polka dot caveat. Games weren't region locked on the portable system, but UMD video releases were. I don't know about you guys, but I owned exactly one UMD video, which was one that was packed in the box with my PSP when I bought it. I never even considered buying UMD videos, not even when they dropped down to like $1 or $2 each on clearance. In my opinion, this one is no great loss, but I guess if you were really into UMD movies, you would have found this region locking frustrating, which I get, even though it didn't bother me personally. The CPU that powers the PSP is a MIPS CPU. Now, I've talked a lot about RISC chips in the past. Remember, RISC stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computers. You can see some of my other hardware videos if you want to understand what those are all about. But next up we have MIPS, or Microprocessor Without Interlocked Pipeline Stages. Just rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? Now, MIPS chips might sound like something that belongs in the snack aisle in your local grocery store. But they're a series of CPUs developed by what is now MIPS Technologies, and they are sort of a type of RISC chip. Did you know that a MIPS CPU powered the original PlayStation? That would be the MIPS 3000A that ran at about 34 MHz. Did you know that a MIPS variant also powered the N64? That would be the NEC VR4300, which is a variant of the MIPS R4300i that ran at roughly 94 MHz. Both of those CPUs were relatively fast for the period of those machines, but things had changed a lot by the time the PSP came around. The PSP is powered by two 32-bit MIPS R4000 R4K CPUs that can operate up to 333 MHz. Note that most early PSP games were maxed out at 222 MHz. But the underlying DNA of the PSP is similar to the prior generation of home-based consoles, which is generally how things went in those days. But the PSP was really more significantly powerful than either the PS1 or N64, so Sony really went beyond that to deliver a new kind of handheld experience. Nintendo kind of dragged their feet a bit and let things sort of slip technologically at this point in the handheld space. Even the much later release of the 3DS was just about on par with the PSP, though to be fair, I was usually rendering a lot more graphics since it technically had to render to 3 screens, 2 for the 3D effect on the upper screen, and then 1 on the normal 2D lower screen. Anyway, the point here is Sony was really ahead of the curve when it came to developing a powerful handheld system. MIPS would eventually fall out of favor for devices, and computing will become dominated by x86 and ARM chips, although MIPS is still around and involved with making RISC-V CPUs. The PSP sort of caps off the MIPS era of console and dedicated portable gaming. If you want to read up on the technical details of the CPU, you can do that at a site that I have linked in the description. Sony had plans for the UMD format beyond the PSP, until the format crashed and burned for video content. Sony was pretty innovative in a lot of ways with the PSP, and I give them a ton of credit for that. Like I said, it was a forward-thinking device in a lot of ways, but it came out at sort of a bad time for physical media. Nintendo had stuck with cartridges for the DS, which came out at roughly the same time, and for a portable system that was probably the right move. The PSP had pretty lengthy load times in some games, as anyone who owned one with physical discs can attest to. Also, there were sometimes skipping issues and stuff if you bumped the thing while out in the big wide world. But I don't want to focus on games on this section, let's talk about movies. Sony put out a bunch of movies and videos on UMD also, and they managed to get quite a lot of different studios to commit to the format in those early days. I remember reading interviews with them where they talked about bringing UMD to other devices in the future, including possibly standalone players that might connect to TVs and things like that. Alas, that was never meant to be. Now, you may not be familiar with the ECMA, but it's an electronic standards group, and Sony had submitted a UMD standard to them that featured an awful lot of details about the format, including some future plans. One of those future plans was to have an automated motorized slot loading machine. Now, if UMD video had taken off, it wouldn't have surprised me if Sony had released a portable UMD standalone player, or maybe even a UMD player that connected to a TV like I mentioned. But the low resolution of UMDs would have made the TV experience not so great, so they might have stuck to a Walkman or a portable player. So I think it's unquestionable that Sony had the right idea for portable videos. UMD just was not the right format for it, and streaming media on phones and other devices basically made portable discs completely irrelevant within the PSP's commercial lifetime. Not every game on UMD was available in the PlayStation Store. I know I mentioned this one earlier and it seems like a duh moment for us crusty old retro gamers, but remember, as I record this, the PSP is about 20 years old, so not everyone's going to be familiar with this. The PlayStation Store became available for the PSP in October of 2008 and required a firmware update on the system for access. That's 4 years after the launch of the PSP almost. Now, there have been a lot of games released on UMD by then, and a good chunk of them would eventually show up on the PlayStation Store. You may be thinking right now that, oh, I bet it was only small games or minor releases that no one cared about that never made it to the PlayStation Store. If you think that, well, you're wrong!
wrong!
I'm not going to give you a complete list here, but big games like Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep, Final Fantasy 20th Anniversary Edition, and the Star Ocean games, to name a few, never found their way onto the store during the lifetime of the system. Oh, and the monsters also left out Salamander Portable, the awesome collection of Salamander and Life Force games on the system. How could they? Anyway, this all means that if you had forked over cash for a PSP Go when it came out, you would have had no official way to play those earlier games, and many other games on the system, which just seems insane. Oh well, live and learn I guess, right? I've included a link in the description to a list of all the downloadable PSP games that were on the PlayStation Store, so you can see if your favorites made it to the store or not. Some of Sony's concept designs for the PSP were a little nuts. Sony is no stranger to putting out some hardware designs that are really out there. I mean, remember the Boomerang PS3 controller before they came back to their senses? Sony had this kind of moment with the PSP when they showed off a concept design of the device at their 2003 corporate strategy meeting. Now, while this was doing the rounds on Twitter just recently, and yes, I said Twitter, IGN and other media outlets actually published these pictures way back in November of 2003. Don't believe me? Well, check this out. The link is also in the description. I'm not quite sure why IGN updated this article 9 years after it was originally published, but hey, here it is. All I can say is, wow, that's really something, huh? I mean, this thing would have been a crime against nature if it were released. It might have been responsible for starting wars. What's wrong with it? The buttons and control pad are completely flush with the surface of the unit. If you're a mid-stage Gen Xer like me that can't stand touchscreen D-pads and buttons on phone games, well, this thing would have been essentially just like that. This kind of design for the inputs would have been a terrible idea. Whoever it was at Sony that said, hey guys, we can't do this, deserves a cookie. I don't think the PSP would be remembered nearly as fondly today had we all been subjected to this version of the PSP, which was clearly designed by someone whose heart was just full of hate. There were a few games in big series that were exclusive to the PSP in Japan, but don't worry, some of them have fan translations now. Big deal, you think. There are fan translations on every system. Yeah, I mean, that may be true, but the PSP had a few big games that were Japan only, like 2 Yakuza games that came out for this system. And take heart, Yakuza fans, because these 2 games have fan translations, and you can play them in English. And there were plenty of other games with translations too. Like what? Glad you asked. Again, I'm not going to list them all, but here's a few. There's Tactics Ogre, Let Us Cling Together, Final Fantasy Type 0, Monster Hunter Portable 2nd G, Shiren the Wanderer 4, Ys vs. Trails, Trails in the Sky Zero, and way more, like Valkyria Chronicles 3 here. Now, I feel unlike with a lot of other systems, fan translations for the PSP don't get a lot of attention, and I don't see them mentioned much in the big world of the old internet. A lot of these translations are complete where you can play the games from start to finish, but not all of them are. So I do suggest looking at the translation info if you're thinking about giving one of these a whirl. I mean, hey, did you even know that you can play R-Type Tactics 2 Operation Bitter Chocolate in English? How did you live up till now without knowing that? I mean, if you could even call that living. The most expensive PSP UMD new in box as of July 2024 is the Hilton family, which isn't even exactly a game. As you know, I usually make the final fact in these things about the most expensive game on the system, but for the PSP here, we're talking about the most expensive software for the system, because it's not really a game, it's a work training simulator called the Hilton family on the disc, but the actual software is called Hilton Garden Inn Hilton Ultimate Team Play. Now, according to PriceCharting.com, you can snag this UMD for the low price of $2,948 brand new. Bargain hunters can also pick up a complete but used copy for about $1,750. And all you cheapskates out there, and you make me sick by the way, can spend about $1,340 on a disc-only copy. Seriously though, that's quite a chunk of change, isn't it? If you want to find out a little more info on this game, I've linked a video from Rerez, who found the game at a pawn shop for $5 in 2013. Also, this footage comes from his video, so thanks for letting me use that, he gave me permission. Now, if you manage to snag this disc, you won't even be able to play the game. Why not? Because it needs a special memory card, and I've read that it also only works in specially designed PSPs. According to Rerez, who contacted Hilton, they said there were 1,000 copies of this training game printed, but only 500 were actually sent to hotels. And again, it's barely a game really, it simulates tasks like cleaning rooms and fixing things that have broken down. If you want to virtually repair a broken toilet, this is the game for you, my friend. Side note, the second most expensive UMD as I write this, also isn't a game. It's a UMD video title, The Best of Rumble on the Rock. That one goes for $1,700 new, $1,000 used and complete, or $770 for disc only. Alright, so there you go, 11 facts about the PSP that you maybe didn't know. So the PSP was a really great system. I really enjoyed it. I think it was well designed. I think it was way ahead of the curve for portable gaming at the time it came out. And I think it helped transform the idea of what portable gaming could actually be. There are a lot of great games for this system, and I own a lot of UMDs for it. And if you can find things for it pretty cheap these days and you want to experiment with it, hey, go for it. Now, PSP emulation is already really mature as I talk to you now at the end of July 2024. ppsspp is really kind of the only game in town emulation-wise, but it's fantastic. And you can do things like raise the resolution and add fancier effects that were never there on the original hardware, and lots of people have even created patches for games that will let them run at 60 frames per second. It even lets you up the CPU speed beyond what the actual PSP could run at, to increase performance on some other games, and it's really breathed new life into a lot of the stuff for it. So pour one out for the PSP, my friends. It was a really good system while it lasted, and it had a really long commercial lifetime. It's just too bad that the Vita could not mimic the success of the PSP. Alright everybody, so tell me, what do you think? Did you have a PSP back in the day? Did you love it? Did you have your games on disc primarily? Did you buy them from the PlayStation Store when that became available? Do you hate the PSP? Tell me all about your experience with it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share this online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. If you've got some money burning a hole in your pocket and you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that at Patreon, on Ko-fi, or right here through YouTube channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.